Well, let me take this opportunity to welcome you to this evening's seminar. My name is Dr. Harold Isaacs, and I'm Professor Emeritus of History here at Georgia Southwestern. And people who have been here before are familiar with the history of the Third World seminars, and I think it's suffice to say that we'll probably have more Third World Studies activities going on here than any other place in the country. Because I look at the Journal of Third World Studies, which is a major publication in the field that comes out of here. And I look at the seminar series, an aspect of which we have this evening. And I look at the Association of Third World Studies, which started here in 1983 and will have its 33rd meeting in Quito, Ecuador, November 22nd, 24th, 2015. But anyhow, I don't have to tell you how important the Third World is, and especially the subject tonight. Well, let me, before I go on, I knew I'd try to forget something. I want to thank one of my students, Jeffrey Taylor, for taping this seminar. And I want to extend a special welcome to all people that are coming from the community and the faculty. I know Frank and Linda Lee Purvis are here, who just walked in. When I look around the faculty, I see Kurt, Susan, Brad, and I see Phil, and Phil, I call him Phil, He's not Phil, you know who. He's Phil, he doesn't have that kind of money. He's Phil Smedley, our professor of economics. He's been director of study abroad program, and Dr. Sarah Spear, who's, I'm very happy she's here. She's the first director full-time of the Office of International Programs. And I really enjoy working with her. And then Brian Adler, our Vice President for Academic Affairs, is right next to Sarah. And then I see David Hunter over there, is a good friend. And I see Richard Hall over here, and I supposed to see Brian Parkinson, and I see Jason Bergman. And okay, if I missed anyone, blame it on my eyesight. But anyhow, okay, all right. Let me just get to this, because I'm not a speaker tonight. So the first speaker is Dr. Brian Parkinson. And there's some personal history here with Brian and I, because when I retired in 2005, he took my position. So when I retired from full-time teaching, and I think he's done an outstanding job. And so I just wanted to mention that. He's associate professor of history, received his BA and MA from his BA from Georgia Southern University. And I have some very good friends over there. He knows them. And also his PhD from Florida State University. And he taught at Florida State. He taught at Florida State Center in London. And he also taught at Tallahassee Community College. And he teaches many classes here in the area of the Third World, especially the Middle East and Africa, and so many other courses he's published in the Journal of Third World Studies, which I edit. and World History Bulletin. He speaks about, he's fluent in about 5 languages, and Arabic, French, Spanish, Turkish and German. And he's on the advisory board of an outstanding think tank in Washington, D.C., and he studied in Turkey, and he's lived and studied in Indonesia, and he's going to talk about U.S.-Iranian relations. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Parkinson.
Thanks for the job, Harry. Harry's also my neighbor. If we couldn't make it a little bit more uncomfortable for him. All right, so today I want to give you all a general narrative of Iranian history since about World War II up to, about 89-ish. And I'm going to put a lot of American foreign policy in there, but it's not driven by foreign policy. Most of this history is actually driven by Cold War themes and themes of imperialism, but I'm going to try and put as much American foreign policy in there as possible. So let me begin. So this gentleman here, who is striking in appearance, is Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who was the son of another guy named Reza Shah Pahlavi, his father, obviously. And his father had been the Shah of Iran up until World War II, when the British conspired to have him overthrown in 1941. And the rationale for overthrowing his father, Reza Shah Pahlavi, was they didn't believe he could be trusted during the war, and so they installed his younger son, Mohammad Reza Shah. And interestingly enough, this will be seen by most Iranians as a knock against him. They don't believe he's a legitimate figure because he was installed by the West, which I think is hilarious because he would have been installed anyway once his dad died, but I guess that would have been okay, because that would have been the natural course of things, I guess. So this is a guy who will put a lot of trust in his advisors to help him formulate policy. And one of his advisors was actually my best friend's grandfather, and he ends up being like the Iranian version of the FAA, and that'll explain why my best friend's family had to get out of Iran in a hurry at the end of 1978. So having said that, let's move on to the next slide. And that brings us to Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the prime minister during the period. And Mohammad Mossadegh was actually the son of the nobility. He actually came out of a noble line in the Qajar family. The Qajar family, they were the prior dynasty in Iran, just preceding the Pahlavi dynasty. And as Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh is going to be a figure who latches on to the theme of nationalism to accomplish his goals. He's going to try and build broad-based support based on nationalism in Iran. And so one of the things that he does is he makes oil a major issue. I don't know if y'all know this, but Iran has a lot of oil. That's my sarcasm. Actually, Iran has tons of oil. And so, but the problem for him is that Iran was not getting or reaping the benefits or the windfall from this oil. A certain British company, which y'all now know as BP, was getting most of the proceeds or revenue from this oil. BP stands for British Petroleum. And it had been, before that it was named Anglo-Iranian oil. At this time it's called Anglo-Iranian oil, and before that it was called Anglo-Persian oil. And so what he wants is a better deal with Anglo-Iranian oil, but the British are going to take a very hard, firm stand, hard line with him, and they're not going to budge on any deals. They're getting the vast majority of any oil revenue coming out of the southwest of Iran, where most of their oil is. So during this period, Mohammad Mossadegh will start forging alliances. The main one that he will forge is with the Tudeh Party. The Tudeh Party was a communist party in Iran. The Tudeh party was the Communist Party of Iran, but he also forges an alliance with the ulama and the ayatollah. The ulama, in Islam, the ulama are the clerics of Islam. And the ayatollah is the head religious figure in Shia Islam, which is the brand of Islam practiced by 99% of Iranians. But as he gets more and more radical over time, Mossadegh is going to move farther and farther to the left. That is, go farther and farther towards the communists. And as he does this, he's going to lose the support of the Ayatollah, a certain Ayatollah Khamenei, not Khomeini, who comes in later, but Khamenei. And then later he will lose the support of his own parliament. Mainly because he has an all or nothing perspective on getting oil revenue from the British. So what happens during this period is, as he's trying to pressure the British to give up greater and greater amounts of oil revenue, the British begin a boycott of Iranian oil. It's like placing sanctions on Iranian oil. And this has a startling effect because the British are able to get the United States in on this this boycott of Iranian oil, and other Western, mostly European nations to boycott Iranian oil. And so Iran's oil revenues bottom out because the British got the West to join in this boycott. The economy, Iranian trade, and their jobs all decline, and it forces Mossadegh into extreme action, much like what's happening in Iran now. Sanctions have forced Iran to come to the negotiating table, just like these sanctions, the boycott of Iranian oil, forced Mossadegh to maneuver. So what does Mossadegh do during this period? In a panic, he declares martial law, and at the same time, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah, he flees to Italy. So we have a situation of martial law in Iran, and the Shah has flown to Italy. And that brings us to the first major involvement of the United States in Iranian politics, Operation Ajax. I actually named a dog of mine after this. I had a nice Doberman named Ajax I named after this. So, not the soccer team. I'm sorry to disappoint. So what was Operation Ajax? This was a clandestine effort, mostly by the Americans, to reinstall the Shah of Iran on the Pahlavi throne. The man involved mostly, who headed it up, was this man on the left, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, the inventor of the teddy bear. No, I'm just kidding, that was Teddy Ruxpin. So Kermit Roosevelt worked for the CIA. He hired some Iranian thugs, and I use that word lightly, and this general, Zahedi, to work with him to put Mohammad Reza Shah back in power. This was the second major mark against Mohammad Reza Shah because, again, he's being installed by the Americans on the throne. This is a mark of illegitimacy in the eyes of most Iranians, in terms of nationalism, that is. He also convinced the Americans to lend him $45 million in aid. He didn't want to come back without saying, I didn't get something out of this. He also got the Americans to convince the British and Anglo-Iranian oil to give up a greater share of their oil revenue. He wanted to show that he had done something in terms of nationalism. So that's where we are right there. Let's move on. Okay. Also during this period, Mohammad Reza Shah is going to start developing an intelligence agency in Iran. He first supports British intelligence in Iran, and he also starts working with Israeli Mossad agents to set up Iran's own intelligence branch. This is the first leader of that, Timur Bakhtiar. And that group is called SAVAK. SAVAK is kind of like the FBI and CIA all rolled up in one, but when they come and get you at night, you don't see them again. Okay, so they're when they come looking for information, you are disappeared. So they're a very scary organization. So that's that, and that brings us to the death of the Ayatollah Kashani. During this period, when the Ayatollah Kashani dies, there's no consensus figure to replace him in the ulama. There's no consensus figure to be the next Ayatollah of Iran. During this period, this guy right here, Ruhollah Mousavi Khomeini, will be thrown into exile. He will be exiled by Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi. And the reason why is because he was radical. He was very anti-American and very anti-Shah, and he was a very beloved figure in Iran. And so they sent him into exile. He went into exile and ended up in Paris, France. And there from Paris, he will use media to try and continue criticism and propaganda attacks against Iran. It kind of worked like this. He would make tape recordings, old cassette tapes that your parents and grandparents might have told you about. He would make tape recordings of his speeches, very fiery speeches, and then he would have these tapes smuggled back into Iran, where they would be duplicated, copied, and disseminated amongst the population. That's how he got his word out. I don't want y'all to know what Americans used to call him. Just to start trying to rhyme things with Ayatollah. And that brings us to the White Revolution. The White Revolution is one of the main causes for what will later be known as the Islamic Revolution. The White Revolution was a revolution in Iran that was based on a series of 4 reforms, all decreed by Mohammad Reza Shah. As a matter of fact, this is a picture of Mohammad Reza Shah in 1963 talking to the crowd. In Iran, they call the masses, the multitude, the crowd. In the Arab world, they call it the street. So in Iran, they have the crowd. In Egypt, they got the street. Having said that, the White Revolution started with land reform. And land reform, according to Mohammad Reza Shah, was where they were going to try and take land from the rich and distribute it amongst the poor. Although very little money did leave the hands of the rich and filter down to the poor, most of the land was actually redistributed from the ulama, the clerics of Iran, down towards the peasantry. And so, of course, this is going to garner much opposition from the clerics, who every Friday after Friday prayers are going to preach against the Shah for what he's done. The second major reform was agricultural reform. During this period, Iran is going to start trying to mechanize agriculture. And when you mechanize agriculture, you don't need as many farm hands, right? The more you modernize agriculture, the less people you need to engage in it. And so where do these people go? These people that had been farming for a living. They go to the cities. They're these disaffected people. They go to the cities where they join the urban poor. And there they are very, very upset and want to return to Islam as an answer to all of their problems. It's a very simple answer to complex problems. The third reform was social reform during this period. And during this period, what Mohammad Reza Shah wants to do is kind of emulate another major Islamic or Muslim figure who's going through major reforms, a guy named Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal over in Turkey. But Mustafa Kemal is going to take a much more radical reform trajectory than Mohammad Reza will. So they both give women suffrage during this period. Only Turkish women get to remove their veils. So he's kind of pursuing a moderate course of social reform. He also wants to take education out of the hands of the ulama, because Islamic education was in their hands and in their control, and there they were able to shape and mold the minds of the next generation. So he wants to take that out of their hands, make it secular so that he can have control over the curriculum. But of course, this makes the ulama just more intransigent, more upset, more in opposition to the Shah. And then finally, there's military reform. His military reforms were all about creating a hierarchy in the military where he had greater control over the army and the other military branches, the other military services. And what he actually does is he creates intelligence services within each branch of the military to make sure that there's no opposition to him. And if there is, he gets rid of them. The Shah is not a good guy, okay? Although my friend Nader thinks he was great. He was wrong. Corruption. This is very pixelated, these pictures. Oh well. All right, during this period, Iran has a massive amount of oil revenue coming in. This is in the 1970s. There will be two major oil shocks in the 1970s where the price of oil it skyrockets, and Iran will be awash in money. And yet, at the same time, there's tons and tons of corruption associated with the people working for the Shah. Most ordinary people were accusing these people, these elite Iranians, of Western ossification, although I doubt they were using that vocabulary. They were accusing Iranians of being mesmerized by America and Europe. And they were saying that very, very little of the oil wealth that was coming into Iran during this period was trickling down to ordinary people. So we're starting to see increased polarization in Iranian politics during this period. And the poor, who are the masses, they are going to increasingly either lend their support to the Tudeh party, the communists on the left, or Ayatollah Khomeini, the ulama on the right. And that brings us to 1971. In 1971, the Shah threw the largest party in world history. It still stands as the biggest party in terms of the amount of money that was spent in world history. And it was all to celebrate the 25th century anniversary of Iranian history. So think back to the movie 300, guys, okay? Going back that far, actually farther than that. So at this party, he's holding these luxury banquets, these sumptuous banquets. He's invited dignitaries from around the world, all the royalty, all the nobility, all the heads of state show up. As a matter of fact, all the major intellectuals in the world were showing up as well. There was a professor at Florida State who I didn't study under because he was a Europeanist, but he went to this party. He was invited. He was flown to Iran because he was a big-time historian, French Revolution. And they were all put up and given a wonderful time, all in front of Persepolis over there. Persepolis is the ancient city over there where they're having massive parades on a daily basis. Meanwhile, while they're having this massive party, ordinary Iranians are suffering. So there's a stark dichotomy here. Another problem for most Iranians was the theme of the party. In Islam, they have this concept in Arabic that goes like this, al-jahaliyyah. And al-jahaliyyah means the period of ignorance. And anything in Islam prior to 628, which is the first year in Islam, anything prior to that is the period of ignorance because it's prior to the revelations that Muhammad received and the development of an Islamic state. Well, by throwing this party, they are celebrating that period of ignorance. This is anti-Islamic, it's pre-Islamic. As a matter of fact, Pahlavi is the ancient name for Farsi or Iran, the pre-Islamic name for that. Foreign policy and graphs. This is exciting. I know that's what y'all came here for. So in 1945, the Shah, he's able to convince the Russians to pull out of northwestern Iran. Okay, and he also, during this period, he's trying to play the East off versus the West. So he's trying to kind of balance foreign policy by playing the middle ground between the East and the West. He's not the only guy who will do this. Mubarak will do the same thing in Egypt during this period. So after consolidating power, he wants to play off the East versus the West. In 1960, Iran joins OPEC. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Other OPEC nation states that you might think of are Saudi Arabia, Venezuela. These are the countries that have large amounts of oil underneath their ground. But he does something that he thinks is in his best interest, but most Iranians are against it, and that is he sends oil to Israel. The Shah is a big supporter of Israel, and he sends oil to Israel, and most ordinary Iranians are actually against that. Okay? And so this leads to some internal opposition. He was also, incidentally, exporting oil to the USSR at the same time that he was supposed to be a kind of ally of the United States. And this is all taking place within the context of the Nixon doctrine of the period. The prior major doctrine or foreign policy doctrine was the Eisenhower doctrine. The Eisenhower doctrine came out in the 1950s, and it basically said that if you are fighting communism anywhere, we will come and help you, and you don't even have to pay for it. But the Nixon doctrine, which is going to be elaborated in the middle of the Vietnam War, we can't afford to pay for it anymore. So yeah, sure, we'll still help you fight against communists, but now you're going to have to pay for it. So also the Nixon doctrine involves three pillars of support for the United States in the Middle East, and those three countries include Iran. Iran is one of the three pillars of support for the United States in the Middle East. The other two major countries would be Israel and Egypt. So during this period, the United States is busy selling a lot of weapons to Iran, and Iran becomes the largest military in the Middle East, buying up American fighter aircraft, tanks, rockets, you name it. And that brings us to the Yom Kippur or Ramadan War in 1973. This was the war in which Israel almost was defeated, and Ariel Sharon comes in and saves the day like the hero he was. But also during this war, you'll see that the price of oil skyrockets. So the first major oil shock takes place in 1973, and now Iran, with even more money, can buy more weapons. And as more and more money comes into Iran, we have major inflation problems in Iran. And so, of course, inflation is not necessarily a concern for the elite, rather for the poor. So most commoners are affected by this high level of inflation in Iran relative to the price of oil and all the weapons that they're buying from the United States. Reasons for the Islamic Revolution. There are quite a few. It's not just, as my friend Nader likes to believe, it's all Jimmy Carter's fault. My friend Nader, his grandfather he was a colonel, actually his father was a colonel in the Iranian Air Force, and his grandfather worked for the Shah directly. He was a cabinet member for the Shah, and so he grew up with these two men telling him the Islamic Revolution was all because Jimmy Carter didn't support us. It was all Jimmy Carter's fault because Jimmy Carter's supposed to support bad guys. The Shah was not a good guy. All right. So, I don't know if y'all know that, but he's a neighbor about 8 miles down the road, Jimmy. All right, so one of the reasons for the Islamic Revolution was the White Revolution. It had upset the ulama. Do y'all remember the ulama? Those are the clerics. Also, they had a change from rural to urban during the White Revolution. At the same time, Iran is becoming a much, much more urbanized country. Iran's population is doubling every 20 years since about 1900. So they have massive amounts of population problems. As a matter of fact, most Iranians today were not alive at the time of the Islamic Revolution. We also have inflation that's associated with the economy. That's a problem, that's a hardship for most young Iranians. Ordinary Iranians are fed up with the Shah, who they see as pro-American. And so they either turn to the far left, the two-day Communist Party, or the far right, the religious parties. And then also during this period, Khomeini is increasing his barrage of propaganda against the Shah. The Bazari and the Ulama make an alliance, which is to the detriment of the Shah. The Bazari are the merchants of Iran. Y'all have heard of a bazaar, right? This is a word that's come into the English language from Farsi. These are the merchants, the shopkeepers in Iran. They've made a political alliance with the Ulama, and that is to the detriment of the Shah during this period. So these guys, they get stronger when the Shah gets weaker. Finally, during this period, we have massive amounts of demonstrations. These demonstrations are kind of hard to fathom. The crowd takes to the street. The Shah, he's desperate. He dismisses his ministers. My friend Nader, his family, they get on planes and go to France. Half of his family stays in France. The other half end up in Louisville, Kentucky. And that's how you end up with Persian boys being Kentucky Wildcat fans. I don't get it. But, so these demonstrations, let me put these into perspective for you. In one of the demonstrations, they are millions of people take to the streets, and the army begins firing on the demonstrators. That's how you know if a revolution is going to be successful or not. Does the army side with the government or the people? Okay, recently in Iran, they had something called the Green Revolution. The army sided with the government. Okay? An escalation of the demonstrations takes place in December of 1978 on the anniversary of the Battle of Karbala. Karbala is one of the seminal moments in Shiite Muslim history. When their martyr Hussein is decapitated at the Battle of Karbala. And so it's a very, very emotional moment for them. It's kind of like Easter for them. I'm trying to make an analogy. It's not really apt. So at the anniversary of the Battle of Karbala, 2 million people take to the streets. Everyone goes on strike. The economy is in shambles, and that's when the Shah tries to fly to the United States. He gets on the phone with Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy's like, you can't come here. And so he flies to Egypt. So who's in power? No one for the time being, until Ayatollah Khomeini flies from Paris to Tehran. There he gets major support when he returns. He's seen as a true nationalist. Almost everyone that's left in Iran, because all the people that supported the Shah have gotten out, so he has support by everyone. And we have the Islamic revolution. Immediately, the Shah holds a referendum, a kind of vote for the population, and he asks them if they want to accept an Islamic constitution. And over 90% of the population votes for it. And most of them didn't even know what they were voting for, or what that meant, or what they were getting. So let's talk about that constitution for a second. It gave almost all of the power in Iran to the ulama. And within the ulama, there's a council called the Guardian Council. And that Guardian Council was initially headed up by Khomeini, and basically whatever he said was deemed law. The Sharia is now law. And the Guardian Council is in control of Iran still to this day. And that brings me to the Iran-Iraq War, which is always interesting to talk about. All right about the time that the Islamic Revolution is finishing up getting rid of the Shah and installing Khomeini and getting a constitution, we're going to have a new war in the region. And this war is going to represent a major shift in the traditional Arab-Persian rivalry. At this point in history, Iran was in the middle of a revolution, and Saddam Hussein, y'all might have heard of this guy, he thinks, hey, these guys next door are in the middle of a revolution. right about now would be a good time to attack them. So why does he want to attack Iran? Well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, he wants to get control over a region called the Shatt al-Arab. This is the Shatt al-Arab. Let me point, and I can explain where you are. Iran, Shatt al-Arab, Kuwait. So this is Iraq going up that way. Iraq is a big country with lots of oil wealth and lots of shipping that needs to get out, but they have a very narrow area in which they can get their ships out. So he wants to move to the east and get that area as well, because those people over there are Arab. They're not Persians, they're Arabs living in Iran, and that's where almost all of Iran's oil fields are. Okay, so he wants to increase the size of their access to the Gulf, get the Arab population, and get the oil. Do y'all know what this war we're currently involved in Iraq is called? Anyone? Yeah, we got soldiers over there. Do y'all know what it's called? Let me ask, is it called World War I? No? World War II? No. The Korean conflict? No. Vietnam War? No. We're in the third Gulf War right now. The second Gulf War was when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So this, right now that I'm talking about, is the first Gulf War. In this Gulf War, who does the United States side with? Can y'all guess? You get a 50-50 chance. Iran? Oh, Iraq, yeah. Actually, the United States becomes a major ally of Iraq against Iran. President Reagan actively supported Saddam Hussein during this war. As a matter of fact, this is Donald Rumsfeld. Donald Rumsfeld was President Reagan's special envoy, meeting with Saddam Hussein and pledging to give American military aid, American military support to Saddam Hussein in this war against Iran. Donald Rumsfeld will later be the Secretary of Defense for President Bush. And so when President Bush says that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, everyone thought he did because we gave it to him. Reagan gave him those weapons of mass destruction. Those were our weapons of mass destruction. I guess Bush just wanted them back. All right. So so the United States, we support Saddam Hussein, not Iran. Why? Because most countries, including those in the Middle East, viewed the Iranian Revolution as a destabilizing force. All these Sunni Muslim governments in the Middle East, they saw what was happening in Iran, and they said they don't want that to happen in their home countries. Okay, the United States saw it as a destabilizing force, so we supported Iraq. The only major country to support Iran during this war was the USSR. I guess they had to pick some side. So another the major reason that the United States supports it is because we're going to practice a policy of containment, contain the Islamic Revolution. The Soviets actually also want to contain the Islamic Revolution. They're afraid. They're in Afghanistan at this time, from 1980 to 89. They're in Afghanistan, and they're afraid that this Islamic Revolution will go up into Afghanistan and into Soviet Central Asia. So the last thing they want is for the Iranian Revolution to escape its borders. So we provided weapons only. This was a very, very bloody war. Over 500,000 people died in this war. The financial support for this war came from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. They're the two countries that helped fund Iraq to fight Iran. Iraq, Saddam Hussein was a Sunni, Kuwait is Sunni, Saudi Arabia is Sunni. They're all Arab and they were all Sunni fighting against Persian Shiites. Okay? But after this war, Saddam Hussein's going to be $80 billion in debt to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. And so that's one of the major reasons he invades Kuwait in 1991. The war ended because both sides were exhausted. They had too many casualties. They were even using young teenage boys, 13, 14-year-olds, to fight on the front lines during this war. One of the major takeaways from this war is that nationalism was actually more important than religion. You see, Iraq is 2/3 Shiite. It's only 1/3 Sunni, and yet all these Iraqi Shiites, they sided with their country of Iraq rather than fight against them with their Shiite brethren over in Iran. And all these Arabs that were in the south of Iran, they were Shiite, and they thought it was more important to fight with Iran against Iraq. So nationalism turned out to be a major player in this Iran-Iraq war. And I feel like I've gone long enough. I was going to talk about the Iran-Contra affair, but I've already bashed on Reagan enough today. So I'll let Jason talk.
They can't hear you, so. Come down here.
No, just really quickly that if any of you want windows to the world credit, if you'll come to the back with your IDs following that, we can swipe your IDs and you'll be able to get take the survey for that. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, I'll ask. Next speaker is David Jason Bergman. He goes by the name Jason Bergman. I don't think he likes that name, David. He's assistant professor of political science here, and he's an authority on President Jimmy Carter, and has made extensive study of his life and the impact of religion on his life and presidency. And he got his PhD from Florida International University and had a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Georgia. And he teaches a lot of different courses, including Jimmy Carter internship. And he's published articles in several journals and encyclopedias. And he's spoken about 3 times, I think, at the National Historic Site, Jimmy Carter National Historic Site in Plains. Is that right, about 3 times? Okay. He's going to talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Thank you.
How's everybody this evening? Doing pretty good? Tonight, my focus, as Dr. Isaacs, and thanks for putting this program together, is dealing with the United States presidential leadership in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And of course, my angle is going to be a little different in terms of Dr. Parkinson. Is in terms of my interests and my specialties is dealing with American politics and therefore kind of looking at the world from the United States and then outward. But also to kind of make a point here when dealing with matters of windows to the world, dealing with matters of foreign policy, but also recognizing that foreign policy is also domestic policy. That one is not separable from the other and it has ramifications. And it matters in terms when thinking about in terms of politics, in matters of policy, it matters who's in charge. It matters which leaders might hold power. Before I continue and go on to looking at some particulars in terms of American politics, I just want us to kind of get a sense of what we're talking about in terms of the center of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Obviously in terms of looking at the country of Israel, but also I want you to kind of see in terms of the square mileage. We're not talking about very big places here. We're talking about a country such as Israel proper, about the size of New Jersey, looking in terms of the West Bank, which is one of the occupied territories acquired by Israel in the Six-Day War of 1967, about the size of Delaware. The Golan Heights, which is a strategic position conquered by the Israelis, also in the Six-Day War. Notice in terms of the size of it, it is just a little bit bigger than Sumter County. But again, when looking in terms of the importance in terms of the world, American policy is critical in terms of these areas. And a lot of flashpoints in terms of conflict in the world often centers in these locations. The Gaza Strip is also another location that was acquired by the Israelis in the Six-Day War, and East Jerusalem. And again, this is an area in terms of looking at what's going to happen in terms of resolving the conflict, in terms of what is Israel's capital? Is it one single unified city? Or if there is to be a Palestinian state, will East Jerusalem that was taken from Jordan in the 67 war, will that become the capital of an independent Palestine? In terms of considering and examining the United States' relationship with Israel and looking in terms of our role in the Arab-Israeli conflict, it really begins in terms of 1948, at least from a formal standpoint. Beginning in 1948, when the United States became the first country in the world to recognize the independence of Israel, the independence of a Jewish state. This was happening at the time period in which the British were pulling out. The mandate was ending on May 14th of 1948. And one of the things in terms of driving U.S. policy at the time and under the consideration for Harry Truman is to try to beat the Soviet Union in recognizing this country. And again, that's one of the things, as Dr. Parkinson had mentioned, that often guided the United States policy in the mid-20th century until the early 1990s, was our rivalry with the Soviets. And so, at least early on, in terms of looking at our approach and our relations to Israel, it was in part driven from that angle. One did not know for sure whether or not where is Israel going to align upon independence. And this is one of the internal debates and one of the interesting things I think about the Truman years is that it wasn't a clear-cut decision. And one of the things that presidential scholars and presidential observers have appreciated or have recognized or have extolled about President Truman is that this decision was a risky decision, a bold decision, done even against the advice of some of the leading figures in his administration, namely in terms of General George Marshall, in terms of Dean Rusk, Dean Acheson, George Kennan, in terms of some of the key wise men, if you will, in terms of foreign policy at the time in shaping the American Cold War, they wanted to hold off on recognition. In fact, perhaps not even recognizing Israel at all. In fact, the main consideration for those in the State Department is that, in fact, the United States should wait and perhaps recognize Palestine. That perhaps American policy should lean towards the Arabs. After all, they have oil. After all, they're larger. After all, they have more weapons. And in terms of a war breaking out, they're likely going to win. Therefore, in terms of U.S. policy, it is a risk to recognize them. But nevertheless, Harry Truman goes ahead and does that. I included a quote over here. Truman did kind of see or understand history from kind of the angle of kind of the big man story, the big man of history. And he kind of saw himself in that light as kind of being a pivotal person that can change the course. And he saw himself in terms of kind of a righteous Gentile, someone who might be able to play a large role in terms of the fate and future of the Jewish people. Since Harry Truman's decision in 1948 to recognize the State of Israel, American presidents have largely followed suit in terms of espousing and or adopting a pro-Israel position. This is also true in terms of the party platforms for both the Republican and Democratic parties. Both of them have affirmed this, and showing in terms of President Obama. Again, it's one of the things of the kind of excessive language, perhaps, direct language, you might say effusive language in terms of demonstrating or trying to demonstrate our support, and that Israel is one of the key allies of this country. In terms of one other aspect for presidential candidates to kind of demonstrate and kind of follow in the Truman footsteps and to show their devotion to Israel, this is the Wailing Wall or Western Wall to the old Jewish temple. It is often seen as kind of the axis mundi or center of the world of the Jewish religious tradition, holiest spot. It's often believed in terms of the old temples in Jewish history, the point in which God had his throne on earth, where his presence was actually in the midst of his people. I'm sure you recognize a number of these individuals on their road to the White House making a pilgrimage. A pilgrimage may be defined in terms of a politician visiting a holy site, perhaps the holy sites, and it may not even be their own religion. It may be in terms of key voting groups that might be part of their electoral coalition. You see Barack Obama, you see Hillary Clinton, George W. Bush, John McCain in 2008. Alongside him is the Democratic vice presidential candidate back in 2000, Senator Joe Lieberman, and Mitt Romney. This is a bipartisan project that both parties have embraced, and they often demonstrate their commitments through acts even on when it's election season. Next point to note and emphasize about considering kind of the domestic character of the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict, is as Bob Lovett, who had worked for the State Department and he was an advisor to George Marshall. This was his main critique of Harry Truman and Truman's decision to recognize Israel. He thought it was exclusively about winning votes. That Israeli politics, Arab-Israeli politics are about domestic politics, about winning and losing elections. The quote comes from in terms of 1948, and I want you to think about in terms of the circumstance and this idea going forward. 1948, President Truman was not seen as a viable presidential contender. He was seen as perhaps one going to go down to defeat. He did not match kind of the glory and grandeur of his predecessor, Franklin Roosevelt, and it was largely seen as perhaps a foregone conclusion that he was going to lose that year. But one of the things, or one of the political calculations that is charged, is that Harry Truman, to help shore up his party, to help shore up his level of support, is that endorsing an independent Israel might help rally some key figures within the Democratic Party, namely the liberal wing of the party, those who might be interested in maybe voting for Henry Wallace and the Progressive Party that year, and that perhaps they might stay on board with Truman in his re-election efforts. The other thought was perhaps by recognizing Israel, it might tap into some of the religious sentiment in the South that might draw support from the states' rights campaign of Strom Thurmond. But in terms of noting the other campaign materials is to show that it is quite obvious and quite evident that presidential campaigns do have different outreach groups, different outreach components and directors to target specific constituencies in the United States to try to put together a winning coalition. Back in the 2012 election, the Obama campaign produced literature. A couple of these pieces did come to my house dealing with the Israeli situation. The Florida Democratic Party, the National Jewish Democratic Council produced literature, campaign mailers that would show President Obama, the picture I had shown earlier, showing him at the Wailing Wall. They would include quotes from former Prime Ministers Ehud Barak, Shimon Peres, and the current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And the point was that the Democratic Party was trying to show is that the leadership within Israel trusts Barack Obama, and therefore we as voters should trust the president as well. And that the president has Israel's security, and that we should reinforce that for another 4 years. Next point to note is there's been a lot of news coverage in dealing with the United States and our current relations with the country of Israel. Some have described the relationship between the current president, President Obama, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as perhaps the lowest point in U.S.-Israeli relations going back to 1948. Some have noted in terms of the relations between Netanyahu and Mitt Romney during the 2012 campaign, the fact that the two of them had worked together in a consulting firm going back to the 1970s, the impressions that Prime Minister Netanyahu had given that he was supportive of Romney when Romney came over to Israel in 2012. In terms of the recent election here in 2015, some of the comments made by Netanyahu and his Likud party, perhaps retracting their support for the peace process, perhaps his endorsement in terms of a two-state solution, in terms of maybe making comments about the role of Arab voters in Israeli politics, that they're coming out in droves and trying to defeat Netanyahu and his electoral coalition. And because of this, personal differences, some have noted that perhaps U.S. relations with Israel are at a difficult point, and perhaps the President of the United States is going to offer a reassessment of our policy and perhaps pivot towards a more pro-Arab posture. But what I want to note to kind of prevent certain stereotypes or to get caught up in contemporary news and the media sometimes driving stories, or maybe the opposition party just driving stories, that this is the worst possible nature, or this is the worst state in which our relationships have been. The reality of it is that even though Israel's long been a close friend of the United States since 1948, there have been many low points. There's been many high points in this relations, and that's quite normal in terms of how countries engage one another, and there can be personality differences, policy differences. This is just an example to illustrate a Republican president from the 1970s, Gerald Ford, and he's writing, these quotes are all from his memoirs describing the difficult relationship that he had with Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and the Israelis' insistence on continuing to expand and build settlements into the occupied territories of Gaza and the West Bank, and their seeming unwillingness to meet with the Egyptian leader, Anwar Sadat, to deal with Hafez Assad, the president of Syria, and try to resolve the issues from 1967 and the 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War, the Ramadan War that Dr. Parkinson had mentioned. And because of that, it drove Ford crazy in terms of his perceptions of Israel and Israeli leadership. But as I said, these are things that can happen and have happened across time. President Reagan had his difficulties with Menachem Begin. George Bush Sr., Bush 41, had his difficulties with Yitzhak Shamir. In fact, Rabin called this perhaps the worst moment in U.S.-Israeli relations, as Ford used the language reassessment. In other words, what's going on now between the United States and Israel, this is nothing new under the sun. Nothing new. There are difficult moments that come in terms of policies and perhaps personalities. One of the things, as I mentioned previously, that is part of the difficulties is election results. And there's no doubt that the current administration perhaps did have preference that the Zionist Union Party would have won this go-around in terms of Isaac Herzog and Tzipi Livni, that their coalition would have come to power and perhaps they could have restart the peace process between Israel and their neighbors. But in terms of the negative results or setbacks from the American standpoint, this too has happened repeatedly. I mentioned a number of years where it becomes clear in terms of looking at presidential papers, looking at presidential memoirs, years in which the incumbent president, the administration, seemed to express a preference for the party that ultimately lost. For instance, in terms of 1977, that was the first year that the Likud party, the consolidation party, right, the party currently of Benjamin Netanyahu, that was the first time that they had come to power. And that was a party that seemed to take a much harder line in terms of the occupied territories and perhaps their lack of willingness maybe to deal with their Arab neighbors. That perhaps it might be a more difficult haul to bring the Israelis to the table. So there's no doubt that the American administration, the Carter administration, was kind of pulling for Rabin and for the Labor Party. But the same thing is true in 1984, that the Reagan administration preferred the Labor Party, that is the center and center-left party of Shimon Peres. You look at Reagan's memoirs in American Life, he has much more positive things to say about Peres than he does about Shamir. Same thing with Bush 41 in terms of the elections of '88 and in the transition in 1990. He was also disappointed, Bill Clinton, that is, was disappointed in terms of Netanyahu's victory in '96. So this is something that has gone on back and forth, that they watch our elections, we watch their elections, and sometimes the president is disappointed with returns, but nevertheless, those are the individuals that you have to deal with. So again, currently what's going on is nothing new. In terms of the peace process and the pursuit of peace between the United States and key Arab countries and with Israel, American presidents, at least since Harry Truman and especially since the Six-Day War in 1967 and going forward, each American president has attempted at some point to involve himself or to appoint an envoy or to have his Secretary of State be involved in the process. These images here are showing President Reagan, President Bush 41, Bush 43, and Bill Clinton, each of them in their respective efforts to try to reach out either to the Israelis or perhaps in the top image there in President Bill Clinton with King Hussein of Jordan and the peace treaty signed between them, his role as a mediator between Israel and an Arab neighbor. Or in this case of Bush 43 at the Annapolis Conference in 2007, an effort to restart the peace process between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. In terms of the peace process from the standpoint of domestic politics, why are presidents interested? Why do presidents care? These are some of the aspects of why a president might get involved, why a president might decide to assign a cabinet member, to appoint an envoy. These are mostly noting in terms of electoral reasons. And that's one of the things in considering in terms of why does a president, or maybe perhaps why doesn't a president get more involved? One should always consider our election cycles and that the windows of opportunity for a president to act are, usually quite narrow. Because one has to consider that every even year in the United States is an election year. And usually in terms of those election years, most presidents are usually unwilling to take large risks, perhaps risks necessary in terms to achieve a peace agreement. But these are some of the electoral reasons why a president might get involved. There might be legacy questions in which a president might get involved. You often read in terms of the memoirs or reading through presidential papers when they prioritize. Sometimes their most difficult decisions, they purposely wait until a second term if they indeed get a second term. That's why it's not surprising when Bill Clinton got so heavily involved in terms of the Camp David agreements that he was working on in the summer of 2000 and then the end in December of 2000. He knew his time was up. He knew that the 22nd Amendment was kicking in, that his 8 years were up, January 20th, 2001, it's over. But he understood that part of the things, at least in terms of once he was in power, that perhaps he could still shape a legacy and try to quickly achieve an agreement before his time ran out. In fact, that was a key reason why Israeli and Palestinian negotiators ultimately did not make an agreement. Delegates had said, we will only be able to do this perhaps if Bill Clinton was president. And of course, he was leaving office, and they weren't sure what George W. Bush's preferences were going to be. When one examines in terms of the presidential record and how they view the region, how they view this particular conflict with Israel and its immediate neighbors, with Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, these are usually the reoccurring reasons mentioned in their memoirs why they might get involved, or why they're concerned, or why this area can trigger conflict, or at least trigger perhaps economic interest, perhaps economic aid, military aid to this part of the world. One, obviously, is the reoccurring Cold War mentality, the fear that the Soviet Union might influence the region, might expand into the region. As already mentioned, in terms of the Eisenhower Doctrine, the Nixon Doctrine, let's face it, throw in the Carter Doctrine while you're at it. That too played an important role in terms of defining in terms of the Persian Gulf and fear of Soviet influence into that area. Another aspect in terms of why presidents are interested in this area beyond the politics is the fact that since Israel was or became an independent state, there were 4 wars, one in 48, one in 56, one in 67, one in 73, and especially in terms of the last 2, nearly drew in the United States and the Soviet Union. So a fear not of World War I or World War II, but of World War III that could involve perhaps the superpowers. Oil is a main concern, fear that the Soviets might gain control of the main oil supplies in the world. Here's the Ayatollah from Iran. There was concern in terms of perhaps the expansion of the Islamic Republic, the Islamic Revolution. American presidents had feared in terms of maybe the radicalization of relatively moderate regimes like Egypt, perhaps going further towards nationalism and expansionism, and perhaps even further into the Soviet orbit. So a number of reasons why presidents might be involved. A moral reason is sometimes mentioned in their documents. We support Israel, or we need to be involved and protect Israel because of the legacy of the Holocaust. The fact, in other words, we owe them, that the West owes them, and therefore it is incumbent upon us to be involved and interested in terms of their fate. In terms of my particular research interests and matters of publication, as Dr. Isaacs mentioned, dealing often with President Carter. And one of the areas of most interest to me in studying President Carter is the religious angle. And this is one of the things, as you can read up here, you can identify up here, that is different when one looks at the historical record from other presidents. Rarely do other presidents cite a religious reason for U.S. involvement with Israel, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the larger Middle East. Carter alone, for instance, when you look through memoirs, repeatedly and continuously refers and references to religious reasons. Even in terms of his memoirs, Keeping Faith, when he, in the section that deals with Israel, the very first reason he mentions why that captured his interest was the fact that he studied the Bible. The fact that he had perhaps known more about Israel as he was growing up, or the history of Israel, than he did the United States. He often talks about the fact that his Sunday school education, the fact that he continues to be a Sunday school teacher, continues to inform his interest and his desire to see peace take place in that part of the world. For him, when one thinks about in terms of defining politics and the nature of politics, perhaps in some of our classes we might think about it being in terms of the allocation of goods, right? The distribution of resources, material things. Carter often sees and understands politics as the extension of the gospel, and that perhaps in terms of the political hero and the political model, perhaps might be Christ himself. And he repeatedly used this language, both in terms of the prayers that were organized prior to his meetings with some of these leaders, perhaps when he'd go speak in terms of the Egyptian legislature or go to the Knesset in 1979, he would often infuse his speeches, his rhetoric, and religious terminology. So sometimes, too, this might be a motivation that might interest or involve a president, and where they might prioritize this issue perhaps above some of the others. In fact, I'd also argue that this vision that Carter had in terms of trying to make the world a place more compatible with the teachings of Christ, that it might have also drew his attention to other areas in the third world. A larger reconciliation program that perhaps might drive his interest towards issues dealing with Turkey and Cyprus, perhaps dealing with apartheid conditions and the transition from white minority rule to black majority rule in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, perhaps in terms of trying to improve our relations with Latin America and his negotiations with the Panama Canal treaties, perhaps too in terms of supporting détente with the Soviet Union and easing in tensions, and as well as reaching out to the People's Republic of China. That's the current topic I'm working on, is looking at the religious angle there and some of the conversations that President Carter had with Deng Xiaoping, and in terms of what he hoped for, in terms of why normalization with China. It's not just simply about trying to open up China to American business interests. For Carter, it was actually about soul winning. Carter saw China as perhaps one of the largest markets in which you can evangelize and spread the word. In fact, in terms of their state dinner there in Washington, D.C. on January the 29th, 1979, Carter has revealed over the years in terms of the contents of that conversation. And the contents of the conversation revolve religious rights in China. So this is something that Carter has often done through the years and in different foreign policy situations. This leads then to perhaps the pivotal and seminal moment in U.S. involvement in presidential leadership in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that's the Camp David summit meeting of 1978 from September the 5th to September the 17th. It's really unprecedented and really unreplicated in terms of the level of presidential involvement, the hands-on approach to try to deal with a foreign policy situation where for 13 days at the presidential retreat in Maryland, basically the president had the prime minister of Israel and the president of Egypt locked up to try to negotiate and try to resolve at least one of the key phases of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And Carter hoped that his personal involvement, his personal interest, his shuttling back and forth, and this leads to the next one, shuttling back and forth between and among the cabins at Camp David, that he could produce an agreement with the largest Arab country in the Middle East, produce an agreement that was seen as kind of the linchpin in terms of Arab-Israeli warfare, and perhaps too even finding an agreement and a solution, and that's the framework for Middle East peace, to once and for all deal with the Palestinian situation. To recognize that it's not just those Arab countries that have power, that have organized militaries, but also in terms of other identifiable peoples that have become casualties in the conflict, and that is the displaced Palestinians. Those that hold the land in terms of Gaza and the West Bank. So in terms of when we say the Camp David summit produced two accords, and this is it. The framework for the conclusion of a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, and the framework for Middle East peace. What I want to note, and my students better take down, are the UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. These negotiations at Camp David and all subsequent Middle East peace efforts have been arranged, have been organized, and the delegates meeting with the United States being a facilitator. All of them have been based upon and rooted on and authenticated on these two resolutions, 242 and 338. The fundamental idea here in terms of these arrangements is an idea of exchanging land for peace. The land that we're talking about, again, is the Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem. In the case of the peace treaty dealing with Egypt and Israel, talking about giving back the Sinai Peninsula to the Egyptians. as well as in terms of opening trade efforts and travel efforts and waterways and landways between and among the key Arab players, Egypt and Israel, as well as Jordan. But also an exchange in terms of this land for peace is that the Arab country would give full, total, and complete diplomatic recognition to Israel. And Egypt became the first country to do that. And this is the UN mandate. The UN mandate is about land for peace, is that both sides have obligations and responsibilities. The United States, when we've been involved, have tried to help them get there on satisfactory terms. So that was the first part, is in dealing with in terms of the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel that would ultimately and formally be concluded by March of 1979. In terms of the framework for Middle East peace, let me just say this, that is one of the key regrets for President Carter, is that the second agreement, the framework for Middle East peace, was not really given full attention, full opportunity to be developed and implemented. And in terms of when we think about in terms of the tragedies of the Middle East, I mean, this is one of those aspects. And again, the connection between international politics, domestic politics. One of the key reasons why it doesn't happen is because Carter loses re-election. You lose one of your key players. By October of 1981, one of your other key players, Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt, is assassinated. Menachem Begin, first Israeli prime minister from the Likud party, who did have interest in trying to show and prove that the Likud party, first time in power, could actually govern, could actually make accomplishments, could also secure Israel. His wife dies in 1982. He starts developing health problems, depression. He resigns by 1983. By the end of 1983, the three key players, in 1978 and 1979, the Arab-Israeli conflict, they're gone from the scene. They're no longer in politics, or they passed away. And that's one of the realities in terms of the peace process, is that sometimes there's these windows of opportunity, and those windows of opportunity can close quickly. And that's one of the key things that Carter regretted. He was the first American president to talk about the idea of Palestinian rights, a Palestinian homeland. And that's one of the things he regretted, that he was not given the opportunity for that second term to move on that framework for Middle East peace. Carter would often argue that these points, and I think there are some truth to them, that might be kind of at the core, perhaps, of presidential leadership, perhaps what might make the peace process successful. And I think there's a great deal of truth to that, is that it does require hands-on presidential involvement. It is not to solve it, but where we make it a key policy priority, where it requires the attention and involvement of the president, the monitoring of the president, perhaps even the president of the United States to be directly and intimately involved in the details. Carter, in fact, would write key sections of both frameworks. And he would use what he called the single document technique, where he made sure that when he's dealing with two parties, that if there's any changes made to the document, he would immediately show it to the other side to make sure that whatever is ultimately agreed to, there's one version. That's part of the problem we're seeing right now with perhaps the United States and dealing with Iran, right? There's a lot of commentary out there that there may be more than one version, more than one interpretation. That's one of the key things that Carter wanted to avoid, and make sure it is clearly in writing, both sides see it, and that he is kind of that mediator, bringing it to each side and monitoring each and every change. Carter's continued, I'm going to skip that one. Carter's continued his interest in this policy matter since he's left office. And a lot of the points I made about dealing with the Palestinians and their role, and some of his regrets, and some of the things that perhaps needs to be adopted going forward, he's explained in some of his successive work since he's left office. The last slide that I want to go ahead and note in the interest of time, these are the key remaining issues when dealing with the Arab-Israeli conflict, dealing with in terms of the Palestinians and the Israelis, And I'll just run through them quickly in terms of complete withdrawal and what does that mean in terms of the Israelis from the occupied territories, what indeed are the occupied territories, what will the role be of settlements throughout these pieces of land, security and recognition for Israel, and I put in question mark because this is something that too has developed here in recent years, the idea of recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. Previously, that was not the standard, that was not a condition. The idea was simply to recognize Israel. But now we find in terms of the Likud government under Benjamin Netanyahu, we see it even with the Iranian negotiations, perhaps a precondition, right, in order for this deal to go through, perhaps recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. Presidential candidate Marco Rubio is introducing an amendment in the United States Senate to that very point. Status of Jerusalem will be the capital of Israel, will be the capital of Palestine, will be the capital of both countries. Palestinian right of return, about the 600,000, 700,000 that lost their lands back in 1948. Will they and or their descendants be able to return, or will it only be a token inclusion? Carter thinks it will be a token inclusion, that only maybe a few thousand. Ultimately, any kind of final arrangements will be allowed back. Final borders. This is something, too, that's been a big issue under the Obama administration. What does that entail? Do you go back to the Green Line of 48, 49? Do you go back to 1967? Are there any, is it permissible to have any adjustments to the 67 borders? And if there is to be a Palestinian state, what type? What type will be allowed? Will they be allowed, for instance, to have a military? Will it be a demilitarized state? Will they have access to the Jordan River? Will it be a contiguous state, right? In terms of the Gaza Strip and West Bank, what will ultimately be the connection between those entities? Okay, so there's still a lot of work to do. But as I said, I think ultimately if there is going to be an agreement, a president does need to be involved. And I'll end it with that. And I do thank you for your attention and your time tonight. Appreciate it.
Okay, we have time for questions, so I'm sure. But everything going on in the Middle East, there's got to be some questions.
Can you explain a two-state solution to this crisis and how that could work?
Is that the $64,000 question?
Yeah.
Right, in terms, and that's an interesting thing. In terms of where does the peace process go? And in terms of the recent election and some of the statements by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, right, seems like he's retracted his support for an independent Palestinian state. He's perhaps said maybe that went too far. But, you know, the reality of it is which is it? Because on the one hand, it's hard to think about a one-state solution, and that being satisfactory to the Israelis, and especially those who affirm that Israel has to be and must be a Jewish state. Because simply demographics in terms of birth rates between the two peoples might in time have a larger Palestinian population, right, than a Jewish population. And the fear is, through democracy, that the Palestinians could vote and change the very nature. And that was, I think, one of the concerns that Netanyahu was mentioned, right? The Arabs are coming out in droves in the election and trying to unseat him. The other option in terms of one-state solution to try to deal with the differences between the Israeli Jewish population and the Israeli Arab population might be to violate the very democratic character of Israel, that is repression. And that's kind of the point that Carter was making in terms of his second exclusive book in dealing with the Middle East, right? Peace, not apartheid. His concern is that if Israel does not adopt a fair solution and move to it, it could destroy its very moral and democratic character. Because in order to maintain power, and they're already seeing it perhaps in the West Bank, that they're having a strict segregation and apartheid-like conditions. That's his main concern, and I think that was a concern even going back to the 70s. Because in fact, the first word that I could be able to find in the record that a top official used was Yitzhak Rabin. I mean, Carter didn't invent it. I mean, it came from the Israeli leadership that this is why the peace process must continue. Two-state solution, I think it's difficult, at least on the Palestinian side, when you have Hamas controlling in terms of the Gaza Strip and Fatah controlling the West Bank in terms of whether or not you have a single unified voice that can represent and fully articulate a Palestinian position. So I think it's a difficult thing to think about what the options are. I think the Clinton administration came close in offering about 90% of the West Bank to the Palestinians, giving them access to the Jordan River. It would be a demilitarized state. They would also have control of the Gaza Strip. And at least from the standpoint of the Clinton administration, Arafat inexplicably walked away from Camp David and did not offer continuous proposals. So we got close, you might say. But what the ultimate two-state solution will look like, your guess is as good as mine, but I tried to outline some of the contours and what it might involve.
Yes, sir, David.
I have a comment, and first I want to thank Dr. Parkinson and Dr. Burgess for just a wonderfully stimulating presentation. And I want everybody to really recognize Dr. Isaacs and what he continues to do to highlight the power of education and to shed light on regions of the world that don't always get it. And you've been a true joy, and you continue to be that. And I certainly appreciate that. And as our students continue to develop, they will also continue to recognize your influence. So I want to say thank you very much for all that you continue to do, and we look forward to the very next one as well.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question for Dr. Berggren. You mentioned the ebb and flow of these relationships is really the norm, right?
Right.
Given Netanyahu's recent election and, of course, our election politics, is this a time to sort of look for optimism, or a time that is the low part, the pessimistic side?
Yeah, and that's, again, one of those, very good questions that it seems like in the United States, we're never done with the election season, right? In terms of President Obama, I think that's what's interesting about the direction we have seen so far since January of 2013. His movement, perhaps, into his ultimate vision of what he sees in terms of foreign policy. We've seen the movement towards Iran in the second term. We've seen the movements towards Cuba, right, with some of the Americas here recently, second term. We've seen some of the harder edges of U.S.-Israel, second term. As I mentioned earlier, they're using Netanyahu in their campaign brochures down in Florida, right? So some of the differences are coming out. If President Obama decides to take on this issue, and I'm not sure if he will. I mean, he's got a lot on it. He's got a lot on his plate. That I imagine that at least for the next 2 years, that the relations are probably going to continue to be strained, and there's not going to be a lot of work. Netanyahu, if you take him at his word, has already pledged that there's not going to be a Palestinian state under his watch. It'll be interesting to see the other candidates. Right, we're in the campaign season. The one I'm most interested in is Hillary Clinton. Is to see what sort of posture she takes and when she starts answering the larger questions about the Middle East, U.S. policy. What does she agree with in terms of President Obama, and where does she disagree? And obviously, in campaign seasons, nomination contests, the question of Israel always comes up. Now, I will say this, if Clinton is the nominee, and Clinton did end up being president, there is some precedence where, even though it was tough, there were some agreements that Bill Clinton was able to acquire from Netanyahu, both in terms of withdrawal from Hebron. You had the Wye River memorandum. So there was some movements to try to hand over land to Palestinian security. Large-scale settlements, not sure if we're quite there yet. It still might require different players here and in Israel and Palestine. Yeah.
Well, first of all, no one actually knows what's in the agreement. So, it's, as Jason mentioned earlier, all these pundits are postulating, but no one knows exactly what's in it. But from what I can surmise, I'll take that over war any day. Tired of war. And, you know, Iran's in dire straits right now. Their economy's really bad. They're hurting. And so they're giving up a lot. Iran is giving up a lot for this, and I mean, if they're giving up fissile material, if they are getting rid of all the highly enriched uranium above the 3% threshold that of uranium enrichment that you need for just nuclear power, I don't see why we don't take it.
Aren't they worried, they were worried that it was soft fuel and that there's a possibility they still conceal a nuclear weapon?
Yeah, but then we're just dealing in hypotheticals at that point. You know, I guess that's a bridge we'll cross when we come to it, right?
Take one more question. 5 minutes old. One more question. Well, let me say this. I want to thank the speakers for wonderful presentations this evening. And I want to thank you for your attention and your support of our program. And so, have a good evening, and hopefully we'll see you at the next Third World Seminar or the next International High Program